The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the courtyard as tourists moved in their familiar patterns. It was 3:15, and the shift had been unremarkable until that moment. Standard tourist flow, standard photography requests, standard questions asked from appropriate distances. Cameras were raised, smiles were prepared, and the ritual of proximity to something ancient and ceremonial continued as it had for centuries. Children pointed at the horses while adults read plaques explaining the history, and groups formed and dispersed with the organic rhythm of sightseeing. The mounted guard tracked it all with peripheral awareness, not watching directly, not engaging personally, but cataloging every movement through years of trained observation. This is the invisible work of ceremonial duty, maintaining position while simultaneously assessing threat, looking forward while seeing everything, remaining still while preparing for movement. But one woman moved differently. She emerged from a tour group near the eastern gate, her stride purposeful, her attention fixed not on the architecture or the history but on the horse itself. She approached the mounted guard with a confidence that suggested she didn't understand what she was approaching, or perhaps she understood perfectly and simply didn't care. The distance closed, 10 meters. 7, 5. The horse saw her first. Animals possess sensory awareness humans can barely comprehend, reading intention through body language, scent, and energy. And this woman's energy signaled something the horse recognized as wrong. Protocol exists for reasons most visitors never consider. The King's Guard maintains its position not as decoration but as functional security, and each mounted sentry represents hours of training, strict adherence to regulation, and an understanding that the uniform carries weight beyond ceremony. The training begins long before a guard ever sits on a horse in public view. Months of instruction cover de-escalation techniques, crowd psychology, threat assessment protocols, the legal boundaries of engagement, and the precise circumstances under which verbal commands transition to physical intervention. And beyond the human training, there is the partnership with the mount. These are not arbitrary horses, they are specifically selected for temperament, size, and trainability, and they undergo their own rigorous preparation. They learn to stand motionless amid chaos, to respond to subtle commands, and to distinguish between appropriate interaction and boundary violation. The barriers are psychological before they are physical. Most people sense the invisible line they photograph from a distance, admire the discipline, and respect the space between observer and observed. Cultural conditioning plays a role, along with generational experience and basic social awareness of authority symbols. But some people either lack this awareness or choose to ignore it. This woman did not sense that line. She moved past the initial boundary with casual disregard, her hand extending toward the horse's neck as if approaching a petting zoo animal. The guard registered the transgression immediately, not through any dramatic shift in posture or a visible reaction, but internally. The assessment began. Threat level, low but escalating, intent unclear. Possibly benign, ignorance intervention threshold not yet reached, monitoring status active. The guard's posture remained unchanged, shoulders back, eyes forward, maintaining the discipline of stillness. But the horse responded to what the human could not yet articulate. Its ears pinned back slightly, and a tension entered its frame that only those who work with horses daily would recognize. The animal's breathing shifted subtly, its weight redistributing in preparation for potential movement. The first warning was silent. She touched the reins. Not with malice, not with aggression, but with an assumption of access that protocol explicitly forbids. The contact was brief, fingertips grazing the leather, but in the calculus of boundary enforcement, contact itself represents escalation. The reins are not decorative, they are functional equipment representing control of a large animal trained for military purpose. Touching them without permission is not merely disrespectful, it is potentially dangerous. The guard's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly as years of training compressed into a single moment of controlled assessment. Does this require verbal intervention? Does this require repositioning? Does this require repositioning to supervising officers? The calculations happen in fractions of seconds. Meanwhile, other tourists began to notice some continued photographing, capturing not just ceremony but confrontation, while others sensed the shift in atmosphere and stepped back instinctively. Human crowds possess collective awareness, and when one member violates the social contract, others recognize it even without fully understanding why. The cameras that had been casually documenting ceremony now focused with new interest. This is how moments become viral content, not through planning but through the organic recognition that something unusual is occurring. The woman spoke to the horse in words the guard could not make out clearly, her tone suggesting affection, perhaps even admiration. But tone does not override boundary. Intent, however well-meaning, does not erase the fundamental breach of protocol. She moved closer still, her body now positioned directly in front of the horse's chest, her hands reaching toward the bridle with the kind of familiarity reserved for personal animals, not working military mounts. The horse shifted its weight, a small movement, a redistribution of balance that signaled growing discomfort. The guard applied pressure with his legs, a communication invisible to observers, a reminder to the horse to hold position and await command. But the horse is not merely a vehicle, it is a trained partner with its own threat assessment protocols. And this tourist had crossed from ignorance into active intrusion. The moment stretched thin. This is where training meets reality, where protocol encounters the unpredictable nature of human behavior. The guard had options, multiple response pathways available within the framework of acceptable action. Option 1. Continue monitoring without intervention and hope the woman's interest wanes naturally. But this carried risks of escalation, of modeling acceptable behavior for other tourists, of compromising the horse's security zone. Option 2. Radio for assistance from supervising officers. But this would create a 30 to 60-second delay and carry the secondary risk of appearing unable to manage standard tourist interaction independently. Option 3. Direct verbal command, meet it clear, documented through witnesses, escalating the situation but establishing definitive boundary. The guard made a decision, not with anger, not with drama, but with the cold precision of someone who understands that boundaries exist to prevent exactly this scenario from escalating further. He spoke. Step back from the horse. The voice cut through the ambient noise with authority that brooked no negotiation. For words clear, direct, non-negotiable. The command carried no emotion, no frustration, no personal offense. This is trained communication. Words selected for maximum clarity and minimum ambiguity. Not please step back, which implies request rather than instruction. Not you need to move away, which opens dialogue, but imperative command, subject, verb, object, action required. The woman looked up, startled, as if noticing for the first time that the guard was an actual person rather than an aesthetic element of her vacation photograph. Her expression shifted through several stages: surprise, confusion, a flicker of defensive posturing. She did not immediately comply. Instead, she smiled, a smile that suggested she believed charm could override instruction, that the uniform was costume rather than authority, that friendliness might negotiate away the boundary she had crossed. She began. Step back now. The repetition carried weight, not volume, but weight. The second in command removed any possibility of misunderstanding. This was not opening discussion. This was directing action. Other tourists had fully stopped now, and the scene had transformed from background spectacle into focal event. The horse sensed the shift in its rider's energy, the subtle tension of preparing for potential action, and the horse made its own decision. It happened faster than most observers could process. The horse didn't rear, didn't strike, didn't execute any of the dramatic gestures cinema has trained people to expect. Instead, it simply moved forward, a controlled, deliberate step that claimed the space the woman occupied. She stumbled backward, surprise overriding her previous confidence, her hand releasing the bridle not because she chose to but because the horse's movement gave her no choice. The guard maintained absolute control, his posture unchanged, his commands to the horse delivered through pressure and position rather than visible cue. The horse took one more step. The woman now stood 3 meters away, her expression shifting from surprise to something approaching awareness. The line had been re-established not through violence, not through aggression, but through the simple assertion of boundary that should never have needed asserting. The crowd watched in silence. Some tourists would later describe it as the horse attacking, while others would say that God allowed the horse to scare her, and these interpretations would spread through social media with the usual distortions of context. But those present understood what had actually occurred: a boundary crossed, a warning delivered, a response calibrated precisely to the level of intrusion. The guard's face remained expressionless, his eyes returning to their forward position. The incident concluded from his perspective the moment compliance was achieved. The horse settled immediately, its breathing steady, its posture relaxed. The woman retreated further into the crowd, her moment of assumed access dissolved. What tourists rarely understand is that every interaction is documented, not necessarily on camera, not always in official reports, but documented nonetheless. The guard would mention it to his relieving officer during shift change. A simple notation: tourist made contact. Was verbally warned, horse repositioned, situation resolved. No formal complaint would be filed, no investigation launched. The guard's actions fell well within protocol parameters. But the woman would carry something else away from that encounter. A reminder that ceremony has function, that discipline has purpose, that boundaries exist not as suggestions but as requirements. She would tell the story later, perhaps to friends or family, and in the retelling she might cast herself as a victim of overreaction, or she might acknowledge the lesson implicit in the encounter. Either way, the line had been maintained. The guard's shift continued for another 2 hours. Other tourists approached, other photographs were taken. Other moments of proximity occurred without incident because those tourists understood what the woman had not. As the afternoon light shifted toward evening, the mounted guard prepared for relief, and the ceremony of changeover would proceed with its usual precision. His horse would be walked back to stables, groomed, fed, and rested. Tomorrow would bring another shift, another crowd, another series of interactions requiring the same controlled assessment. This is the reality of ceremonial duty that carries actual security function, not the drama of combat, not the clarity of obvious threat, but the constant calculation of boundaries, the persistent need to distinguish between harmless enthusiasm and genuine intrusion. The guard who spoke those 4 words, "Step back from the horse," did not consider himself a hero, but rather a professional. He had identified a problem, issued a clear instruction, and allowed his trained mount to reinforce that instruction when verbal command proved insufficient. No escalation beyond what the situation required, no force beyond what achieved compliance. This is what discipline looks like when functioning as designed. What viewers of viral videos rarely consider is the individual nature of these encounters. This was not tourists versus guards. It was one person, in one moment, making a choice that required response. Her nationality is irrelevant, her background immaterial. What mattered was her action in that specific instant. The guard's response was not personal but procedural. The horse's response was not malicious but trained. And the outcome was not excessive but calibrated. This distinction matters because the internet thrives on generalization, on taking individual moments and expanding them into categorical judgments. But ceremony does not work that way. Each interaction is assessed individually, and each response is tailored to specific circumstance. The woman who crossed the line that afternoon was not representative of her culture or nation. She was representative only of herself in that moment, and the response she received was designed not to punish but to correct, to restore the boundary that allows thousands of other tourists to safely enjoy proximity to working military personnel without incident. As darkness settled over the courtyard, the area emptied of visitors. The guards changed, the horses returned to stables, and the ceremony of rotation proceeded with its timeless precision. Tomorrow, new tourists would arrive. Most would maintain respectful distance, while some would test boundaries through ignorance or intention, and the guards would continue their assessment, individual by individual, moment by moment, not because they seek confrontation, but because they understand something most observers never consider. The uniform carries responsibility, the position demands discipline, and the boundary exists not as barrier but as protection. Protection for the tourist who might not understand the danger of startling a trained military mount. Protection for the horse that could injure someone accidentally if pushed beyond comfortable limits. Protection for the institution that balances ceremonial tradition with functional security. For words maintained all of that. Step back from the horse, and when words proved insufficient, action followed, controlled, measured, effective. This is the reality behind the pageantry, the substance beneath the ceremony. Authority that does not need to shout because it knows its own weight. Discipline that does not need to explain itself because it functions with precision. And boundaries that hold not through force but through the simple certainty of enforcement. The tourist crossed the line. The royal guard's horse responded instantly, and the line held.